A young black boy named Daniel returns a missing wallet to a white millionaire named Mr. Carter. Hours later, the police and the millionaire himself show up at his school. What crime did Daniel commit before we get into the story? Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Subscribe. Daniel Thompson awoke to the soothing sound of his mother's voice, which said, "Rise and shine, sweetheart." She called out from the small kitchen of their modest apartment. The aroma of toast and eggs wafted through the air, causing Daniel's stomach to growl. Daniel rubbed the sleep from his eyes and looked around his small apartment. Dreams were painted on peeling paint, and posters of his favorite basketball stars graced the walls of his bedroom. He hurriedly got dressed in his well-worn but immaculate school uniform, and he was thankful to his mother for her effort to keeping their clothing decent despite their low funds. Daniel contacted his mother. In the kitchen, Daniel saw his mother, Lisa, already dressed in her waitress uniform. Her weary eyes brightened as she spotted her son, and she laid a kiss on his forehead. "Eat up, baby. You got a big day ahead of you," she said. Daniel's voice was filled with the joy that seemed to accompany him wherever he went. While they were eating, Lisa reminded Daniel of their family motto, which was, "Remember, honey, it's not what we have, but who we are that matters." Daniel nodded his head in agreement and sat down at their small table, savoring every bite of the simple breakfast. "Thanks, Mom. It's delicious," he said, his smile revealing the gap where he had recently lost a tooth. His young face was serious as he said, "I know, Mom. I'll make you proud." After breakfast, Daniel grabbed his backpack and headed out. The streets of their neighborhood were already bustling with activity. As he walked to his destination, he waved to Mr. Johnson, the elderly man who always sat on his porch, and he gave his best friend Jamal, who lived next door, a high five. School. He took in the familiar sights of his community, such as the corner store with its faded awning, the small park where children played basketball after school, and the community center where his mother sometimes worked extra shifts to make ends meet. Despite the worn-down appearance of some buildings, there was a warmth and vibrancy to the neighborhood that Daniel was able to find. Daniel's mind was filled with thoughts of the upcoming math test as he walked to school on that crisp autumn morning. He kicked a pebble along the cracked sidewalk while reciting multiplication tables under his breath. The familiar sights and sounds of his neighborhood surrounded him, including the rumble of passing cars, the chatter of people heading to work, and the sound of people walking to school. Daniel's attention was abruptly drawn to something that was lying on the pavement just ahead of him. It was a black item that was partly concealed by a fallen leaf. Daniel's curiosity prompted him to hasten his pace, and as he got closer, he discovered that it was a wallet. Black and made of fine-looking leather, Daniel's pulse started to rush. He peered about, but no one appeared to be searching for a lost item with careful hands. He took up the wallet, feeling its smooth surface. It was heavier than he thought, and he could tell it was. Daniel opened the wallet with great care, and his eyes widened as he found numerous crisp $100 notes nestled neatly inside. He had never seen so much money in one place before. Daniel wondered that maybe there was an identification card or anything else that might assist him in locating the owner. But Daniel knew better than to concentrate on that. Instead, he looked for identification in a clear plastic slot. He discovered a driver's license, and the name on the card caused Daniel's jaw to drop. The name on the card was Thomas Carter, and Daniel immediately recognized the name. Mr. Carter was a well-known individual. Daniel's thoughts raced as he thought about Mr. Carter, a businessman in their city who was famed for his money and success. He knew that Mr. Carter resided in the affluent section of town, which was a long way from Daniel's impoverished area. What happened to his wallet? And more importantly, what should Daniel do now? For a time, Daniel pondered about what he should do. All the things that money could buy, such as new shoes for school, a nice dinner for his hard-working mother, and possibly even a basketball hoop for the kids in the neighborhood. But as soon as these thoughts came to mind, Daniel pushed them away. He recalled the words of his mother, which were, "It is not what we have, but who we are that matters." Matters with a deep breath, Daniel carefully closed the wallet and slipped it into his backpack. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant being late for school. Daniel stood on the sidewalk with his backpack feeling heavier than usual with Mr. Carter's wallet inside there. He looked at his watch and realized that he was already late for school. He was late for school, but this was more important. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to decide what to do. The weight of the wallet seemed to press on his conscience. Daniel thought about his mother and how hard she worked to make ends meet. He imagined the look on her face if he brought home all of that money. He thought that her eyes would light up, and maybe she would finally be able to take a break. Day off from her 2 jobs. But then he remembered the lessons she had taught him. She always said that honesty is the best policy, and Daniel could almost hear her voice in his head gently guiding him. He opened his eyes with a determined look on his face, and he knew what he was going to do. The fact that Mr. Carter was wealthy, or that Daniel's family could make use of the money, was irrelevant to him. What was important was that he did the right thing. Daniel took a deep breath and turned around, heading in the opposite direction of his school. He was aware that Mr. Carter's company was located downtown approximately 1 mile away, and he knew that it would be a long walk, but he was determined to do what was right. As he walked, Daniel was determined to get there. He thought about what he would say to Mr. Carter when he arrived. Would Mr. Carter be angry that Daniel had opened the wallet? Would Mr. Carter even believe that a kid from this neighborhood was returning it instead of keeping it? Daniel's palms began to sweat, but he continued walking and passed by stores. Daniel didn't care what anyone thought about him because he knew in his heart that he was doing the right thing. His mother would be proud of him, and that mattered more than anything else as he went about his day. As the day began, people were rushing to work, and buses were rumbling down the street. A few people gave him curious looks, probably wondering why a young boy wasn't in school. Daniel felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement as he approached the tall, gleaming building where Mr. Carter worked. He was about to meet one of the most influential men in the city, and he was going to do something good. As Daniel approached the towering skyscraper that housed Mr. Carter's office, he felt his heart racing at the same time. He stood at the entrance, taking in the bustling scene that was going on around him. Well-dressed men and women were rushing past, their shoes clicking on the polished sidewalk, and sleek cars were parked. The building appeared to touch the sky, and its glass windows reflected the morning sun. It was a far cry from the small brick buildings that were in his neighborhood. Pulling up and letting off individuals who seemed to be important, Daniel felt out of place in his worn shoes and second-hand jacket. After taking a deep breath, Daniel pushed open the heavy glass door and walked inside the lobby, which was large with high ceilings and gleaming marble flooring, and a big chandelier hanging over him. Gleaming like 1,000 stars, Daniel had never seen anything like it before he approached the reception counter, his footfall echoing in the immense expanse. The receptionist, a lady with flawlessly arranged hair, looked up at him with astonishment and said, "Can I help you?" Daniel had never seen anything like it before. In a voice that was courteous but perplexed, Daniel took a deep breath and said, "I'm here to see Mr. Thomas Carter." His voice was barely above a whisper, and the receptionist's eyebrows jumped up. "Do you have an appointment?" Daniel shook his head because he did not have one. A woman's expression softened as she looked at Daniel with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "That's very honest of you, young man. Let me see what I can do," as she made a phone call. Daniel looked around the lobby. Everything seemed so clean and new, so different from his previous experience. "Ma'am, but I found his wallet and I need to return it to him," she said. Area where buildings were old and worn. He thought about his mother, wondering how out of place she would feel here just as he felt. A few minutes later, the receptionist picked up the phone and said, "Mr. Carter will see you very soon." She smiled and continued, "Take the elevator to the 31st floor." Daniel nodded, his nervousness returning as he walked towards the elevator. As he rode up, watching the floor numbers climb higher and higher, he couldn't help but think about how far away he was from home, not just in terms of distance, but in terms of being in an entirely different world. As the elevator doors opened on the 31st floor, Daniel stepped out of the elevator. Out into a world of luxury, the corridor was paved with luxurious carpet, and the walls were decorated with paintings that seemed like they were costly. He felt tiny and out of place, his old shoes sinking into the soft floor. A lady who was dressed beautifully approached him with a pleasant grin. "It must be the young man who discovered Mr. Carter's wallet," she said very politely. "I'm his assistant, Miss Parker. Please follow me." Daniel nodded, unable to locate his voice, and he followed Miss Parker down the corridor, passing past offices with glass walls and sleek furniture. He heard the click of her heels. On the floor echoed in the quiet space, they stopped in front of a large wooden door. Miss Parker knocked gently before opening it. "Mr. Carter, the young man who found your wallet is here," she announced. Daniel's heart pounded as he stepped into the office. It was bigger than his entire apartment, with floor to ceiling. Windows on presenting a spectacular view of the city. Behind a big desk sat Mr. Thomas Carter, a distinguished-looking guy in his 50s. Mr. Carter rose up, his eyes fixated on Daniel. "So you're the honest young man who discovered my wallet?" he said, his voice deep and powerful. Daniel's hand shook as he went inside his backpack and brought out the wallet, and he replied in a soft voice, "Yes, sir. I found it on the sidewalk this morning. I knew I had to return it to you." Mr. Carter walked around his desk and approached Daniel, and Daniel took the wallet and examined it. According to him, everything seems to be in order. He looked back to Daniel with a curious expression on his face. "What's your name, son? Daniel Thompson?" Sir Daniel responded with a voice that was barely above a whisper. Mr. Carter's eyebrows lifted slightly as he repeated Daniel. "Regarding the name, Daniel, I would want to know why you chose to return the wallet. There was a significant amount of money inside." Daniel looked up at Mr. Carter with his eyes wide with sincerity. "It was the right thing to do, sir. My mother had always taught me to be honest." In spite of everything, Mr. Carter's eyes became more gentle as he listened to Daniel's words. He then walked back to his desk and sat down, gesturing for Daniel to take a seat in one of the plush leather chairs opposite him. "That's quite admirable," Mr. Carter said in a thoughtful tone. "Not many people would have done what you did." Daniel sat down. Down, his feet barely touching the floor, he felt small in the large chair, but Mr. Carter's kind words helped him sit up a little straighter. "I appreciate your honesty," Mr. Carter continued. He opened a drawer in his desk and drew out a checkbook. "I'd want to present you a reward for your assistance in this matter." As Daniel's eyes widened and he rapidly shook his head, he responded, "Oh no, sir. I can't accept that." His voice was slightly shaking as he stated, "I didn't bring the wallet back for a reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Mr. Carter interrupted his speech. While the pen hovered over the checkbook, he stared at Daniel with a combination of surprise and respect. "Are you sure that this is a large amount of money? It may be of assistance to you and your family." Daniel thought of his mother working long hours to make ends meet. For a little time he was tempted to take the money, but then he decided against it nevertheless. With a long breath, Daniel looked Mr. Carter in the eye and said, "I'm sure, sir. Thank you for the offer, but I can't take money for doing what's right." Mr. Carter sat back and said, "Honesty isn't a trade, Daniel. It's who we are." Daniel recalled her comments. In his chair, he was observing Daniel with a newfound curiosity. "Well, Daniel Thompson," he began with a grin pulling at the edges of his lips, "you've certainly given me something to think about today." He then rose up and offered his hand to Daniel, saying, "Thank you for returning my call. Wallet, your honesty is both refreshing and admirable." Daniel stood there as well, shaking Mr. Carter's hand with a firm grip, just as his mother had taught him. "You're welcome, sir," he said with a small smile on his face. "I'm just glad I could help." Daniel then left Mr. Carter's office. Heart light and his steps buoyant, the grand building that had intimidated him earlier now seemed less imposing as he stepped out onto the busy street. He took a deep breath. Feeling proud of the choice he'd made, the walk back to school was long, but Daniel didn't mind. He repaid the conversation with Mr. Carter. In his head, he was able to repay the conversation with Mr. Carter in his head. Reassuring himself that he had done the right thing, his mother's words reverberated in his head, and he smiled, knowing that she would be proud of him. As Daniel approached the school, he glanced at his watch and realized how late he was. His stomach tightened with worry, because he had never been late before, and he didn't want to disappoint his teacher. Daniel took a deep breath before pushing open the heavy school doors and making his way to his classroom. He paused outside, gathering his courage, and then knocked softly on the door. Mrs. Johnson's voice called out from inside the room. Daniel entered the room with his cheeks flushing, and all eyes turned to him. Mrs. Johnson looked at him. "I'm sorry, Miss Johnson," Daniel replied with a firm voice despite his anxiety. "I found a wallet on my way to school this morning and I had to return it to the person who gave it to me." She stated this with surprise and worry. "It's not like you to be late." Her brow wrinkled. Owner Mrs. Johnson's face softened. "You returned a wallet. It was really responsible of you, Daniel. Can you tell us more about what occurred?" Daniel nodded, feeling a little more comfortable. He stepped at the front of the class and started to narrate his morning adventure. Daniel concluded, staring at Mrs. Johnson with an apology, and a grin formed over Mrs. Johnson's face. "Daniel, thank you for your time." As he talked, he observed that his students were listening intently, their eyes wide with curiosity, and that was the reason he was late. "Sharing that with us, what you did today, was very honest and courageous, class, don't you think? Daniel set a fantastic example for all of us." The class erupted in applause and Daniel felt his cheeks become heated. He hadn't expected this response as he made his way to his seat. Daniel had not anticipated this reaction. Daniel smiled shyly, grateful for their support, but also a bit overwhelmed by the attention as the day progressed. Daniel found his thoughts drifting back to the events that occurred in the morning. The image of Mr. Carter's surprised face when he returned the wallet kept popping into his mind. His classmates patted him on the back and whispered words of admiration into his ear. Daniel, however, shook his head in an attempt to concentrate on the mathematical problem that was in front of him. He did not want his good deed to divert his attention away from his studies. During lunch, his friends bombarded him with questions about the wallet, and Mr. Carter asked him about it. Daniel responded honestly, but only briefly, because he did not want to make a big deal out of it. Daniel caught himself daydreaming about the tall office building and the busy streets of the city center. He blinked hard and forced himself to concentrate on the task at hand. He said with a shrug that it was just the right thing to do. He was biting into his sandwich in the afternoon as Mrs. Johnson explained a new scientific concept. Daniel was experiencing a mixture of feelings as he packed up his bag as the last bell sounded. He was pleased of what he had accomplished, but he also felt a little odd about all the attention he had received. He just wanted things to go back to normal. He knew that his mother would want him to pay attention in class regardless of what had occurred earlier. Go back to normal walking home. Daniel considered telling his mother what had happened. He knew she would be proud of him, and the thought made him smile. However, as he approached their apartment building, he decided that he wouldn't make a big fuss about it. He would tell her, of course, but he would keep it simple. Daniel climbed the stairs to their apartment while carrying his backpack. The event of the morning began to feel like a distant memory as he focused on the familiar comfort of home and the tasks that lay ahead back in his plush office, Mr. Thomas. He took a deep breath before opening the door, ready to greet his mother and begin his usual after-school routine. Although he was heavy with homework, he opened the door. Carter was lost in thought as he sat behind his mahogany desk. The events of the morning kept playing over and over in his head, and he couldn't shake the image of young Daniel standing there in his worn clothes and holding out the wallet with such earnest determination. Mr. Carter picked up the leather wallet and ran his fingers over its smooth surface. Inside, there was everything. The fact that his credit cards, his driver's license, and a significant amount of cash were all returned without a single item being missing was remarkable, he whispered to himself as he shook his head in disbelief. However, the thing that struck him the most was Daniel's. Rejection of a reward in a world when everyone appeared to be striving for personal gain. This little boy's action stood out like a beacon of hope. Mr. Carter slumped back in his chair, his brow wrinkled in thought. He couldn't simply let this go. Daniel's honesty and, according to him, honesty deserved more than a simple thank you. There must be something I can do, he murmured out loud while drumming his fingers on the desk. He thought about Daniel's look, which included the slightly too small jacket and the scuffed shoes. It was obvious that the lad came from a humble family, yet he was more than adequate. Mr. Carter's thoughts raced with ideas. He could provide financial aid to Daniel's family or even set up a college fund for the youngster. But something told him that Daniel wouldn't want charity. Rather, it had to be something that Daniel had decided to do. Despite what must be hard circumstances, Daniel had chosen to do the right thing. Something that would be more significant. Something that would genuinely make a difference in Daniel's life without compromising the very values that the child had shown. Mr. Carter sat up straight. A thought developing in his head, he grabbed for his phone and a smile flashed across his face as he realized precisely what he needed. In order to do this, Mr. Carter took up his phone and contacted the local police station. After describing the scenario, he was connected to Officer Johnson, who listened attentively to the incident. Officer Johnson responded in a warm and kind tone. "That is quite a remarkable young man." Admiration. "I would be happy to assist you in locating his school with the assistance of the officer." Mr. Carter soon had the name and address of Daniel's school. He thanked the officer and hung up, feeling a surge of excitement. "Sarah," he called out to his assistant to clear my afternoon schedule. "I have an important visit to take care of." The appearance of a police car and a sleek black sedan drew up in front of Daniel's school, as the afternoon light threw long shadows over the playground. The sight of the cars instantly grabbed the attention of children who were peeking out the windows of their classrooms, and their curious whispers filled the air. Officer Johnson stepped out of his patrol car, followed by Mr. Carter emerging from his sedan. The unlikely pair made their way into the school, causing a ripple of excitement among the staff and students they passed inside Daniel's classroom. The teacher was in the middle of a math lesson when a knock on the door interrupted her. The principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, stood in front of her with a combination of seriousness and hardly held enthusiasm. "Excuse me, Mrs. Davis," she said, addressing the teacher. "Could you please send Daniel Thompson to my office?" The classroom fell into silence as everyone's attention shifted to Daniel, and the boy's pulse started to race. To beat his thoughts furiously seeking for whatever crime he could have done, he got up slowly, his knees feeling unsteady under him. "Daniel," Mrs. Rodriguez added, her voice quieter. "Now bring your stuff with you, please," as Daniel collected his rucksack. Daniel's closest buddy, Jake, gave him a comforting nod, but it did nothing to alleviate Daniel's anxiety as he walked down the hallway behind Mrs. Rodriguez. Daniel's imagination raced wild as he did so. His classmates talked and gazed at him. Some of them were worried, while others appeared inquisitive. Wild had something happened to his mom. Was he in trouble for being late this morning? The sight of the police car outside hadn't escaped his notice, and it only added to his worry as they approached the office. Daniel could see through the glass partition that there were several adults inside, including Daniel Rodriguez, the police officer, felt a lump developing in his throat as his heart hammered even harder in his chest. Mrs. Rodriguez put a reassuring touch on Daniel's shoulder before opening the door. "It's okay, Daniel," she whispered in a soothing voice. "You're not in any trouble." Walked inside the office, his eyes widening as he took in the sight before him. There, standing next to Officer Johnson, was Mr. Carter, the man whose wallet he had returned earlier that morning. Mr. Carter's face broke into a warm smile as he spotted Daniel, and for a brief time, Daniel forgot to look at him. As Daniel entered the principal's office, his palms were sweaty, and he could feel his legs trembling beneath him. The sight of Mr. Carter, Officer Johnson and Mrs. Rodriguez all looking at him, caused his stomach to churn with anxiety. Mrs. Rodriguez said in a gentle gesture to a student, "Please take a seat." Daniel's heart raced as he entered the principal's office. Daniel sat down in the chair in front of her desk, his mind racing with the various scenarios that could have occurred if he had returned the wallet. Perhaps he had made a mistake by returning it. Perhaps he should have just given it to a teacher instead. Perhaps Mr. Carter had accused him of taking something from the wallet before returning it. Daniel's imagination was running wild. As he raced wild, he thought about his mother and how sad she would be if he got into trouble. Tears started to fill up in his eyes, and he blinked furiously in an attempt to keep them from falling. Am I in trouble? Daniel eventually managed to choke out his voice, just above a whisper. His brow wrinkled in worry. Mr. Carter came forward and replied, "Oh no, Daniel, not at all." He immediately continued, I'm sorry if we frightened you. That wasn't our intention." Officer Johnson nodded in agreement, saying, "You're not in any trouble, son." Fact, quite the contrary. Despite their promises, Daniel was unable to escape the sensation of dread that had crept in his stomach. He peered from face to face, trying to read their expressions, seeking for any indication that they could be concealing anything from him. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped closer to him while kneeling. Alongside Daniel's chair, "Daniel, honey, take a deep breath," she whispered quietly. "I know this must be stressful for you, but I promise you're not in any danger. We just want to speak to you about what happened this morning." Daniel took a shaky breath. His thoughts still racing, he couldn't grasp. As the grown-up started to explain, Daniel sat rigidly in his chair, his pulse hammering so loudly that he could scarcely hear their words. He was wondering why they required a police officer to be there only to speak about the wallet. Was there more to this issue than he realized? Had he unwittingly done something wrong? Daniel was sitting in the principal's office, his small frame dwarfed by the large chair, and his eyes darted nervously between Mr. Carter, Officer Johnson, and Mrs. Johnson. All he could think about was the fear that was coursing through his body and the desperate hope that whatever was happening, it wouldn't disappoint his mother or get him into trouble. Rodriguez, the tension in the room was apparent, and Daniel's heart was beating so fast that he felt it may explode out of his chest. Daniel, unable to bear the quiet any longer, blurted out, "I didn't steal anything." I swear his voice broke, and tears started to fill up in his eyes. Rodriguez, the tension in the room was evident, simply wanted to help. I discovered the wallet and felt it was okay to return it. I'm sorry if I did something wrong. Mr. Carter's eyes widened in surprise, and he quickly moved to soothe the scared boy. No, Daniel, you didn't do anything wrong," he said gently, leaning down to meet Danny's eye. Officer Johnson walked forward, his expression softening as he said, "Son, you are not in any trouble. We are here because of your good deed, not because you did anything wrong." Mrs. Rodriguez reached out and caressed Daniel's quivering hand. "Daniel, honey, take a big breath. Everything is fine." Daniel's brow wrinkled in uncertainty as he looked at each adult in turn, attempting to understand their comments, but why is there a police officer here?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer Johnson smiled warmly. "Okay, Mr. Carter wanted to thank you properly for returning his wallet." David Johnson did so. "I am here to assist in recognizing your honesty, Daniel. What you did was extremely commendable, and we want to make sure that you are aware of the fact that as the adults continued to speak, Daniel's stiff posture began to relax somewhat. The terror that had seized him so firmly began to lessen its grasp on him. Mr. Carter shook his head with a warm grin spreading over his face and said, "No, Daniel, you're not in trouble at all." Daniel wiped his tears with the back of his palm and sniffled quietly. "You mean I'm not in trouble?" Daniel questioned, still unable to believe what he was hearing. "Thank you, and celebrate your integrity." Mr. Carter's warm grin grew over his face as he stared at Daniel, the boy's eyes, which were still shimmering with tears that had not yet been released. Mr. Carter regarded Daniel with caution as he took a deep breath and proceeded to explain to Daniel why we are here. "For a very special reason, and it's all because of you." Daniel's brow wrinkled in uncertainty. He looked at Officer Johnson and Mrs. Rodriguez, who both nodded encouragingly. Mr. Carter continued, "You know, when you returned my wallet this morning, I was struck by your honesty. It's not every day that someone discovers a wallet full of money and chooses to return it without expecting anything in return." Daniel's shoulders eased a little bit. but he still seemed bewildered. However, he asked in a gentle voice, "Sir, isn't that what anyone would do?" Mr. Carter laughed. Warmly, "You would be surprised, Daniel. Your actions demonstrate a degree of integrity that is uncommon and need to be praised." Officer Johnson stepped up. "That's correct, son. Mr. Carter requested for our assistance to locate your school. We weren't here to get you in trouble. We wanted to make sure we found the best school for you. Daniel Thompson, Mrs. Rodriguez, and Mr. Carter wanted to express their gratitude to you in a suitable manner. Mr. Carter believed that it was essential to acknowledge your good action in front of your students and instructors." Daniel's eyes widened in surprise, and he questioned his voice. Mr. Carter shook his head, his eyes sparkling. "Really, Daniel, what you did deserves recognition. Your honesty and integrity are qualities that should be celebrated and encouraged." As the realization of the situation started to sink in, a little grin began to emerge on Daniel's lips. The anxiety that had been there in his face had been replaced by a smile. Gripped him earlier began to dissipate, and it was replaced by a warm feeling of pride and relief. Mr. Carter said, clapping his hands together, "If you are okay with it, we would like to gather your classmates and teachers for a special assembly. We want everyone to know about your wonderful accomplishments." Kindness and honesty. Daniel's heart raced as he stood in front of the packed school assembly. The gymnasium was buzzing with excitement, and students were whispering to one another and craning their necks to see what was going on. Mr. Carter stood beside Daniel, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. Students and teachers were all present. Daniel felt his cheeks grow warm with a mixture of embarrassment and pride as he spoke, and he glanced at his mother who was sitting there. Mr. Carter began his speech by booming his voice through the microphone. "We are here today to celebrate an extraordinary act of honesty and integrity." He recounted the story of how Daniel had found and returned his wallet. In the front row, her eyes were filled with tears of joy, and Daniel's actions had a profound impact on me. Mr. Carter continued, "In a world where it's easy to look the other way or think only of oneself, Daniel chose to do the right thing, and that my friends deserves recognition." The gymnasium fell silent, and all eyes were focused on Mr. Carter and Daniel. When Mr. Carter announced his decision to do something special, his voice was filled with emotion. He said, "I want to make sure that Daniel's future is as bright as his character." Daniel's eyes widened, and his heart began to pound in his chest. Mr. Carter declared, "I'm going to sponsor Daniel's education all the way through college." A collective gasp echoed throughout the gym. Daniel stood there, speechless and unable to believe what he was hearing. However, Mr. Carter was not done, and he explained that this was not all he had to say. He raised his hand to calm the gathering and stated, "In honor of Daniel Thompson, I am establishing the Daniel Thompson Scholarship Fund. This money will be used to provide financial assistance to students who have shown integrity, provide opportunities for other young people who exhibit the same kind of honesty and character that Daniel has shown." The gymnasium erupted in cheers. Daniel's classmates jumped to their feet, clapping and shouting his name. Daniel's mother rushed forward and encircled him in a tight hug, her tears of joy wetting his face, that she was so happy for him. When the noise subsided, Mr. Carter turned to Daniel and said, "Your small act of kindness has created a ripple effect. Daniel, you have not only changed your own life, but you have also changed the lives of many others. You should never underestimate the power of doing the right thing." The gymnasium buzzed with excitement as the realization of Mr. Carter's announcement sank in. Principal Johnson, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward with a look of awe on his face. He cleared his throat and spoke with a voice that was thick with emotion as he addressed the assembly. "I think we can all agree that this is an extraordinary moment for our school," he said, beaming at Daniel, who had just finished speaking. "Made us all proud today." The teachers who were seated in a row near the front exchanged amazed glances. Mrs. Rodriguez, Daniel's homeroom teacher, wiped a tear from her eye. She had always known Daniel was special, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. As for the students, Their initial shock quickly gave way to unbridled joy cheers. This made us all proud. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. The chant began somewhere in the back and quickly spread throughout the gym amidst the chaos. Daniel stood there overwhelmed by the excitement. Daniel's classmates were on their feet, whooping and hollering his name. Even the older kids who normally tried to act cool were caught up in the excitement. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. The chant began somewhere in the back and quickly spread throughout the gym. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the smiling faces of his shirt teachers and the excited grins of his fellow students. Mr. Thompson, the strict history teacher who was known for his non-nonsense attitude, surprised everyone. He had never been the center of attention like this before, and he didn't quite know how to react. He had never been the center of attention before. He stood up and began a slow clap, and he exclaimed loudly, "This student is what true character looks like." The mood in the gym had totally changed, and what had begun as a stressful and terrifying scenario for Daniel had turned into a celebration of his integrity. The air was filled with a sense of joy and excitement, a palpable sense of pride and joy as the cheering continued. Principal Johnson raised his hands in an attempt to calm the excited crowd. "All right, everyone settle down," he said, though he couldn't keep the smile off his face. I believe it's safe to say that this is a day that none of us will ever forget because of the excitement that was in the air. When the gymnasium started to calm down, Principal Johnson's phone started vibrating non-stop. He moved away to answer it, and as he did so, his eyebrows raised in surprise. As he listened to the caller, he said that it sounds like it would be worth traveling quickly. Before returning to the group, he revealed that the local news station wants to do a report on Daniel's act of kindness. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise as he realized that he had never expected that his simple act of returning a wallet would lead to all of this attention. Mr. Carter put a calming hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "You deserve this recognition, Daniel. Your honesty is something to be admirable." Within an hour, the calm atmosphere of the school was transformed into a flurry of activity. A news van pulled up outside, and reporters with cameras and microphones filed into the building. The principal's office turned into an impromptu interview room, with Daniel and Mr. Carter sitting next to each other. Sarah Chen, a well-known student, was also present. Daniel was given a warm grin by the local news presenter, who then asked him to share his thoughts with the audience. "Can you tell us what went through your mind when you found Mr. Carter's wallet?" Daniel gulped hard, his hands sweating as he faced the camera. "I just knew I had to return it," he replied gently. As Daniel continued to tell his narrative, his self-assurance increased. Mr. Carter then joined in, expressing his astonishment at Daniel's integrity. The reporter listened attentively, her eyes beaming with appreciation as she stood outside the office with the kids. They crowded their noses against the windows in an attempt to get a look of their now famous classmate instructors, gently pushed them away, but were unable to conceal their own pleasure and enthusiasm. When the interviews drew to a close, Sarah turned to the camera with a bright grin in a world that sometimes appears to be filled with negativity. Young Daniel Thompson serves as a reminder that honesty and integrity are still present in the world. This is Sarah Chen reporting from Lincoln Middle School, where a small act of kindness has made a big impact. As the news van pulled away from Lincoln Middle School, Daniel's mind raced with the events of the day, and he couldn't wait to tell his mother about them. After all that had occurred, as the final bell sounded, he hurried home with his rucksack bouncing against his back with each step. Daniel burst through the front door of their modest apartment, out of breath and with his eyes glowing with joy. He yelled out to his mother, who was his mother. Daniel went into the narrative, words pouring out in a hurry, and told her about returning Mr. Carter's wallet and the unexpected visit to the school. The mother walked from the kitchen and wiped her hands on a dish towel. "What's wrong, baby?" she said, with worry imprinted on her face. Daniel rushed into the story, and the scholarship as he spoke. Lisa's expression changed from worry to disbelief, and finally to overwhelming pride as she listened to Daniel. When Daniel finished speaking, She pulled him into a tight hug and whispered, "Oh, Daniel, I'm so proud of you, so." Her voice was thick with emotion as she said, "I'm so proud of you, so." Daniel buried his face in his mother's shoulder, feeling secure and loved. "I just did what you always taught me to do, Mom," he whispered. Lisa held her son at arm's length, staring into his eyes. "You did the right thing, baby. You're growing into such a wonderful young man, just like you've always been." After that, there was a tap at the door, and Lisa answered it to find their neighbor, Mrs. Cruz, standing there with a wide grin on her face. "I just watched the news," Mrs. Rodriguez cried. "Daniel, you are a hero." Words rapidly traveled throughout their close-knit community, and shortly after, neighbors started gathering outside Daniel and his family. Everyone in Lisa's apartment was eager to offer their congratulations to the young boy who had made them proud. Mr. Jenkins, who worked at the corner store, brought a cake. The Patel family, who lived across the street, arrived with colorful balloons. Even Mr. Simmons, who worked on the first floor, showed up with a rare smile on his weathered face. The small apartment was filled with laughter and joy, chatter as neighbors squeezed in, patting Daniel on the back and praising his honesty. Daniel, overwhelmed by the attention, stuck close to his mother's side. As the impromptu celebration continued around him, Daniel found a quiet corner in the small living room. He sat on the worn armchair, his favorite spot for thinking, and watched as Daniel's mind wandered back to that morning when he had found Mr. Carter's wallet. He remembered the weight of it in his hands, and he had a brief moment of temptation when he saw the cash inside. But the thought of keeping it had vanished as quickly as it had come. The neighbors were chatting and laughing, and the scene that was unfolding before him felt surreal, like something out of a dream. When Daniel returned, it had been as natural as breathing. Now, he was surrounded by the warmth and pride of his community, and he felt a mixture of emotions. He was happy, of course, but he was also a little overwhelmed. Everyone was calling him a hero, but he didn't feel like a hero. He had just done what his mother had always taught him was right, and he was watching his mother walk through the throng with her eyes beaming with pride. Daniel felt a pang of something new. Responsibilities. People were looking at him differently now, expecting great things. The scholarship that Mr. Carter had provided was a huge deal, an opportunity for a brighter future, but it also felt like a chance to do something that he had never done before. A lot of pressure. Daniel took a deep breath and tried to calm his racing thoughts. He knew that nothing had really changed. He was still the same Daniel, just a kid who tried his best to do the right thing. The scholarship and the attention didn't change who he was on the inside, but he couldn't help but feel a newfound sense of pressure. As if feeling his stress, Lisa made her way over to Daniel and sat by the armchair. She placed a loving hand on his arm and asked him in a quiet voice, "You okay, baby?" With a little nervousness. What if he couldn't live up to everyone's expectations? What if he let them down? Daniel nodded and managed a faint grin, saying, "Yes, Mom, I'm just thinking about it." Lisa gently patted his elbow and reassured him. "Remember, Daniel, you don't have to be perfect. Just keep being you. That's more than enough." Her words went over Daniel like a wave. Daniel's act of compassion left Mr. Carter feeling sincerely affected, and he nodded, feeling a little lighter. Perhaps he didn't have all the answers just now, but he knew he'd sort it out one day at a time. In the days that followed the celebration, Mr. Carter found himself greatly moved by Daniel's gesture of generosity. As Mr. Carter sat in his spacious office, surrounded by the trappings of his success, he was unable to shake the image of the young boy's humble demeanor and unwavering integrity. Mr. Carter knew that he needed to do more than just offer a scholarship, and with renewed purpose, he called his team of lawyers and financial advisors. He announced that he wanted to establish a scholarship fund. During the subsequent few weeks, Mr. Carter worked tirelessly to bring his vision to life. He pored over documents, made countless phone calls, and held meeting after meeting. The scholarship fund began to take shape, and it was designed to provide financial assistance to children who are similar to Daniel. His voice was filled with determination, not only for Daniel, but also for other children who demonstrate exceptional character. Reward not just academic accomplishment, but also acts of compassion, honesty, and community service. However, Mr. Carter did not stop there. As he learned more about Daniel's neighborhood, he understood that a scholarship alone was not sufficient for these youngsters. They required more urgent help. "And opportunities, we need to build a community center," he told his colleagues one day. "A place where kids can go after school, where they can learn, play, and grow." The concept soon gathered steam, and Mr. Carter envisioned a bright and friendly community center. He wanted it to be a beacon of hope in the neighborhood, a place that could nurture the potential he saw in Daniel and other children like him. As the plans for the community center took shape, Mr. Carter felt a sense of excitement that he hadn't experienced in a long time. He wanted it to be a space that included a library, a computer lab, and sports facilities. Mr. Carter's initial impulse to reward one boy's honesty was transforming into something much larger. He was creating a community center. Over the course of years, he found himself visiting Daniel's neighborhood more frequently and talking to residents and local leaders to ensure that the center would truly meet the needs of the community. The day of the groundbreaking ceremony for the new community center arrived, bringing with it a sense of excitement and hope that swept through Daniel's neighborhood. The sun shone brightly as if nature itself was celebrating this momentous occasion. He left behind a legacy of kindness and opportunity that would impact the lives of countless people for years to come. For the occasion, Daniel stood nervously next to his mother, fidgeting with the collar of his new shirt. He still couldn't quite believe that all of this was happening because of him. His mother gave him a reassuring squeeze on the hand, and her eyes were filled with pride. Mr. Carter arrived looking dapper in a suit, but he greeted Danielle with his sleeves rolled up and ready to dig in. As Mr. Carter stepped up to the microphone today, he began his voice to ring out clear and strong, saying, "We're not just breaking ground on a building, we're laying the foundation for a brighter future." His mother then turned to shake hands with the community leaders who had gathered for the event. The crowd hushed as Mr. Carter spoke. Future, he went on to describe the center's aim to foster kindness and community spirit, and who better to name it after Mr. Carter added, smiling at Daniel, than the young guy whose act of honesty inspired it all. Daniel's eyes widened in surprise as Mr. Carter revealed a sign. During the reading of the Daniel Thompson Community Center, the audience erupted in applause, and Daniel felt his cheeks warm with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. As the ceremony continued, local leaders took turns speaking about the impact the center would have on the neighborhood. Daniel listened intently, and his heart was filled with pride. Mr. Carter gave Daniel a little gleaming shovel and asked with trembling hands, "Would you do the honors?" Daniel grabbed the shovel and gazed out at the audience, his neighbors, and his instructors. He was filled with appreciation and hope with each word that was said. Finally, it was time for the symbolic groundbreaking. As he pushed the shovel into the soft earth and turned over the first scoop of dirt, the crowd cheered, and Daniel couldn't help but smile as he stood there with the shovel in his hand. With the realization that his simple act of returning a wallet had set off a chain of events, he realized that his simple act had set off a chain of events that would impact his town forever. As the applause died down, Mr. Carter looked to Daniel with a loving grin. "Daniel, would you want to say a few words?" he said, walking towards the microphone. Daniel's eyes, "But you, Ed," and he felt his heart skip a beat. He hadn't. His palms began to sweat, and he glanced nervously at his mother. She gave him a nod of encouragement, and her eyes were filled with love and pride. Daniel took a deep breath, and then he stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent, and all eyes were focused on the young boy who had started this incredible chain of events. For a moment, Daniel stood frozen in place. He was overcome by the sea of faces that were in front of him, and then he recalled the reason he was there. He thought about the wallet, and he thought about doing the right thing. All of a sudden, the words, "Hello, everyone," came to him. His voice was shaky at first, but it became stronger with each word. "I'm not used to speaking in front of so many people. people, but I want to thank you all for being here today." He paused and gathered his thoughts when I found Mr. Carter's wallet that day. I didn't think I was doing anything special. I just knew it was the right thing to do. My mother has always taught me that even the smallest acts of kindness can make a big difference as seen through Daniel's eyes. Scanned the crowd, seeing nods of agreement and encouraging smiles. I never imagined that returning a wallet would lead to all of this. He continued gesturing at the construction site behind him. It just goes to show that doing the right thing, no matter how small it might seem, can have a big impact. His voice became more confident as he continued to repeat the phrase. He spoke from the heart. This community center is going to be of assistance to a great number of people, and although I am proud that it will carry my name, in reality, it belongs to all of us. It serves as a reminder that every one of us has the ability to make our community better by doing even the smallest of contributions. When Daniel's eyes met his mother's, he saw tears of joy glistening in her eyes. I want to thank my mother for always teaching me to do the right thing, and I want to thank Mr. Carter for his incredible generosity. However, I want to thank everyone here for their support and for believing in the power of kindness. I want to thank you all for being here. As soon as Daniel finished his speech, the audience erupted in applause. Mr. Carter congratulated him by patting him on the back and beaming with pride. Daniel's mother rushed forward to embrace him tightly. As the applause for Daniel's heartfelt speech began to die down, Mr. Carter stepped forward once more, his face beaming with pride. With a sense of pride and purpose, he placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder and turned to address the crowd that had gathered. Mr. Carter began his speech with a voice that was clear and powerful. He said, "I have one more announcement to make today in honor of Daniel's incredible act of integrity. I am establishing a scholarship fund in his name." A murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. It was via the audience that Daniel's eyes widened in surprise, and his mother gasped quietly beside him. Mr. Carter proceeded by saying that the Daniel Thompson Integrity Scholarship would give educational chances to kids who exemplify the same type of honesty and moral fortitude that Daniel demonstrated to all of us. As he paused to let the news sink in, he announced that each year we will select deserving students who have gone above and beyond in their commitment to doing what is right, regardless of the circumstances. This scholarship will cover full tuition for college or vocational training, ensuring that these exceptional young people have the opportunity to pursue their goals. Daniel stood there, astonished by the grandeur of what Mr. Carter was declaring. He felt a range of feelings, including pride, humility, and a sense of duty. His mother grabbed his hand as tears of delight streamed down her cheeks. Mr. Carter went on to say that the students will continue their studies and become leaders in our community. He turned to Daniel and asked him to explain the specifics of the scholarship. "We will be working closely with local schools to identify candidates who are exemplary in their day-to-day lives. The scholarship will be open to students from all walks of life, with a particular emphasis on those who might not otherwise have the financial means to pursue higher education. Daniel, your one act of honesty has now generated a ripple effect that will transform lives for years to come. This scholarship fund assures that your legacy of integrity will continue to inspire and encourage people far into the future." The audience exploded into applause as one of the recipients of the scholarship. Daniel was overwhelmed by the effect that his simple gesture had caused. He looked up at Mr. Carter, gratitude flashing in his eyes, and he was unable to find the words to explain how he felt. However, on the following Monday, Daniel was able to find the words to convey how he felt. When he returned to school, his heart was pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. As he walked through the hallways, he noticed whispers and smiles from his classmates. Some of them even patted him on the back and congratulated him for his honesty. When the bell rang for the first period, instead of paying attention to their regular classes, all of the students were directed to attend the first period. Daniel followed the throng to the school auditorium, wondering what was going on. As he entered the auditorium, he was greeted with thunderous applause from the whole school community, including students, teachers, and staff. Daniel's speech was a special assembly that was held in his honor. When he realized that this was all for him, he was overcome with pride and shame. The principal stepped at the platform with a warm grin and said, "Today we are here to celebrate one of our own." She then went on to say that Daniel Thompson had shown to all of us what it meant to have genuine integrity. Daniel sat in the first row. During the time that Mrs. Rodriguez was telling the story of how he had found and returned Mr. Carter's wallet, Daniel's classmates listened attentively, with many of them nodding their heads in agreement. Daniel's actions serve as a reminder that even seemingly insignificant acts of honesty can have a significant impact. Mrs. Rodriguez continued by saying that he has brought honor to the class, not just to himself, but to our whole school community. She then summoned Daniel to the platform, and despite his unsteady legs, he made his way up the stairs. Mrs. Rodriguez then presented him with a beautifully frank plaque of recognition. "This award is to commemorate this individual." The audience exploded in screams and applause once more as she read aloud the phrase, "Daniel Thompson for his outstanding display of integrity and honesty." Daniel stood there holding the certificate, and he felt a mixture of feelings flood over him. He felt pleased but modest, knowing that he had been recognized for his great performance. The initial shock of sudden fame faded, and it was replaced by a quiet determination to live up to the expectations that were placed upon him at school. Daniel continued to excel in his studies, and his teachers noticed a change in him. Daniel simply did what he believed to be right. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel began to adjust to his newly discovered role in the community. A new spark of confidence in him that was not born of arrogance, but rather of a deeper understanding of his own potential. He raised his hand more frequently in class, eager to share his thoughts and ideas. One day during lunch break, Daniel overheard some classmates talking about a local animal shelter that needed volunteer years. Without hesitation, he raised his hand. Daniel contacted them and inquired about the ways in which he might be of assistance. The next Saturday, he found himself at the shelter, cleaning cages and walking dogs. The joy that he felt in assisting these creatures was unlike anything he had ever experienced until this first encounter with community service sparked something in Daniel. He started looking for more opportunities to give back. He joined the school's environmental club and participated in neighborhood cleanup drives on the weekends. He also volunteered at the community center that bore his name, assisting younger children with their homework. Daniel's mother watched her son grow over the course of his life. With a sense of pride and a touch of amazement, she had always known that he was exceptional. However, witnessing him develop into a community leader at such a tender age filled her heart with joy. As Daniel became more involved in a variety of projects, he discovered that he was inspiring others, and his classmates, seeing his dedication, began to join him. And Daniel never forgot the principles that had led him to return Mr. Carter's wallet in the first place. He remained humble and was always quick to deflect praise and redirect attention to the causes he cared about. One evening, as he was volunteering, the ripple effect of his actions spread throughout the school and the neighborhood. Despite his busy schedule, Daniel never forgot the values that had led him to return Mr. Carter's wallet. Daniel was sitting at the dinner table with his mother when she asked him how he felt about all the changes that had occurred in his life. Daniel paused for a bit before saying, "You know, Mom, at first I was scared I didn't know if I could be what everyone wanted me to be. But then I realized I'm just being myself. I'm doing what I'm doing. What you have always taught me to do, which is to be nice and to assist other people, feels good, and it feels right." As the months went by, Mr. Carter found that he was attracted more and more to the community center that he had helped construct. What had begun as a gesture of appreciation toward Daniel had evolved into something much more than that. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Mr. Carter would leave his office early, trading his suit and tie for more casual attire, and head to the center. The children's faces would light up when they saw him walk through the doors, always ready with a kind word or a smile. Mr. Carter's passion blossomed into a genuine desire to make a difference in the lives of young people. Helping Hand, Mr. Carter took a particular interest in mentoring the young people who were present at the center. He organized workshops on topics such as financial literacy, career planning, and entrepreneurship. His eyes would sparkle with excitement as he shared his knowledge and experience with the eager young minds that were in front of him. But it was his friendship with Daniel that genuinely bloomed. Mr. Carter saw in Daniel a mirror of his younger self, determined, empathetic, and full of promise. He took Daniel under his wing, helping him not only in academics, but in life lessons as well. Their bond got deeper. With each passing week, they would frequently spend time after the activities at the center discussing Daniel's goals and ambitions. Mr. Carter would listen attentively and provide Daniel with advice and encouragement. Mr. Carter would eventually become more than just a mentor. He would fill a void that Daniel hadn't even been aware was there. There was something special about having a father figure to look up to, and Daniel's mother had always been his rock. One Saturday afternoon, as they were cleaning up after a community event at the center, Mr. Carter placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. He said, with his voice filled with warmth, "I'm proud." Daniel's mother had always been his rock. "Of you, not only for returning my wallet on that particular day, but also for everything you've done since you're a remarkable young man." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat, and he was overcome by the emotions that those words stirred up in him. He looked up at Mr. Carter, his eyes shining with gratitude, and he thanked him. As the weeks passed into months, Daniel and Mr. Carter's bond became deeper, and they found themselves spending more time together than ever before, working on a variety of projects at the community center. He expressed his respect and gratitude to Mr. Carter in a gentle voice. While Daniel looked up to Mr. Carter as a father figure and a mentor, Mr. Carter saw in Daniel a young man with enormous potential. On a bright and sunny Saturday morning, they were busy organizing a neighborhood cleanup event. Daniel watched in awe as Mr. Carter effortlessly coordinated volunteers and assigned tasks. Mr. Carter asked Daniel why he was doing this. "Do you not take command of the group that is cleaning up the park?" Daniel's eyes opened, and he questioned in a little shaky voice, "Are you sure?" Mr. Carter smiled warmly and said, "I'm positive you've got what it takes, son. Just remember to listen to your team and lead by example." Daniel took a long breath, and then he nodded. Gathered his group at first, he felt nervous, but as he started assigning tasks and working alongside his peers, he felt a new sense of confidence growing within him. Mr. Carter observed from a distance, his heart swelling with pride. He saw how Daniel encouraged his teammates, praised their efforts, and even found creative solutions to the challenges that emerged brought to his mind his own early days in business, when he was just starting out. In the course of the day, Mr. Carter found himself contemplating his life. He had accomplished a great deal of success in his professional life, but it had always seemed as if something was missing. But now that he was seeing Daniel's development and assisting him, he felt a renewed feeling of. Immediately after the event, Mr. Carter went to Daniel Yu while they were sitting on a bench enjoying some lemonade that they had earned. "Performed an outstanding job today, Daniel. You are a natural leader." Daniel grinned with delight. "Thanks on your accomplishments. I learned from the very best, Mr. Carter." Mr. Carter laughed, and I felt a warmth spread around the room. "Daniel, you are aware that I may be instructing you about leadership via his chest, responsibilities. But you're also teaching me something," Daniel questioned. "What is it that you're teaching me?" Mr. Carter responded in a gentle voice. "You are reminding me of the joy of making a difference," reflecting the wonder that was gleaming in his eyes. "It may be easy to forget what really matters in the business world at times, but watching you develop and seeing how our work here is affecting you is a great reminder. I have gained a fresh outlook on life as a result of the influence it has had on the community." Daniel nodded. The two of them sat in comfortable quiet for a minute, each of them giving careful consideration to the significance of Mr. Carter's statements. They were thankful for the friendship that they had discovered in one another, and as the months went by, the influence of Daniel's honest deed became more and more apparent. Something that was previously a struggling area started to ripple across the neighborhood as a result of the new community center. A simple act of charity performed at the community center was the spark that ignited the change that began to take place in the neighborhood. Youngsters who had previously wandered the streets after school now had a place to go that was dubbed Daniel's Place, which became a hive of activity and optimism. The center provided a secure environment in which students could learn, play, and expand their skill sets. Adults who are interested in enhancing their career prospects might participate in art lessons and even sessions on fundamental computer skills. Opportunities. Mrs. Thompson, Daniel's mother, saw a difference in the street when she was walking to work each day. The street seemed to be cleaner, and there was a newly discovered feeling of pride among the locals, and she often happened to see neighbors clearing up garbage or caring to their gardens. To the little garden patches that had appeared along the walkways, local companies had expanded their operations. Increasing foot activity surrounding the community center drew new consumers to adjacent establishments, which led to the establishment of a flourishing business environment. Mr. Johnson, the proprietor of the corner shop, found himself in need of more assistance in order to meet the ever-increasing demand for his products. Sarah was already making a difference thanks to the scholarship fund that had been established in Daniel's honor. The first scholarship that Daniel's parents, who had always battled to make ends meet, had ever earned was awarded to a brilliant young girl from Daniel's school. In order to make ends meet, they had hoped that their daughter would be able to follow her ambition of becoming a doctor, even if it meant going to the park. The area, which had been ignored and shunned in the past, was suddenly filled with the sounds of children playing and families having picnics. Community members were motivated to take responsibility for their common areas as a result of the cleaning initiatives that were led by Daniel and Mr. Carter. A local technology business saw an increase in the number of volunteers and resources as news spread about the good improvements that had occurred in the community, provided the community center with the opportunity to receive a donation of computers, while a group of retired educators contributed their time. In the context of the tutoring program, Daniel, who was now in his early teens, saw these transformations with a sense of both astonishment and humor. He never in his wildest dreams could have imagined that the choice he made to return a wallet would result in such a significant makeover, despite the fact that he felt completely transformed when he strolled through the busy community center or assisted younger children with their schoolwork. When Daniel was entering his senior year of high school, he discovered that he had a profound feeling of pride and duty. Himself standing on the brink of a prosperous future, the once timid boy who had discovered a wallet many years ago had found himself in a position of. Daniel has developed into a self-assured young man who is revered by his contemporaries and cherished by his community. He is looked up to every day after school, spent time in the community center, either assisting younger children with their schoolwork or providing assistance with a variety of activities that were offered there. When Daniel was here, surrounded by the results of his simple act of generosity, he often reflected about his future. One day, as he was doing so, he was here. While Daniel was sitting in the center's library, his eyes landed upon a stack of college brochures, and his pulse began to rush with excitement. A mixture of enthusiasm and a little bit of fear, college had always been one of those far-off dreams, but now, due to the scholarship fund that bore his name was within reach, Mrs. Thompson noted the serious look on her son's face as she described the situation. Daniel smiled at her as she entered the library and inquired, "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" while resting a soft touch on his shoulder. His eyes were filled with optimism as he looked up at his mother. "Mom, I think I want to study social work in college. I want to learn how to serve others." In an effort to assist communities such as ours even further, Mrs. Thompson's eyes welled up with tears of hope. She pulled him into a warm EMB brace and whispered, "Pride. Oh, Daniel, you've already done more than that. Completed a lot, and I have no doubt that you will do even more wonderful things later that week during their consistent mentorship meetings. Daniel discussed his goals and objectives with Mr. Carter. The successful entrepreneur listened attentively while wearing a pleased grin that stretched over his face. "Daniel," Mr. Carter began as he leaned forward in his chair, "I've seen you develop into an extraordinary young man because of your devotion to. No matter what course of action you decide to take, I have no doubt that you will have a huge effect as a result of being inspired by this community." Daniel, With the help of his mother and Mr. Carter, immersed himself into his college applications, which he spent hours creating because of their encouragement. Each and every word that he wrote, whether it was an essay on his experiences or his hopes and plans for the future, was filled with gratitude for the possibilities that had been presented to him, as well as his commitment to make such chances available to others, as Daniel. Although he was making progress toward his objectives, he couldn't help but think about how far he had gone. The community center was bustling with people. His surroundings served as a continual reminder of the power that can be derived from even a single act of compassion, and he was aware that he was able to overcome the obstacles that were ahead with the support of his family, his mentor, and his whole. With the community behind him, Daniel, his father, watched as the sun started to set on a lovely summer evening. Mother and Mr. Carter sat around a tiny table in the humble kitchen of the Thompsons, where the scent of Mrs. Thompson's cooking filled the air. The aroma of freshly made bread and the aroma of the legendary pot roast filled the air as it was released. Daniel couldn't help but smile as he glanced at his mother and his father, the two individuals who had been his most ardent supporters throughout his life. Mr. Carter, with a gleaming smile on his face, put the dish that was still boiling on the table. While they were about to dine, he was seen helping to put out the dishes while dressed in casual gear, which was a far cry from his typical business outfit. The atmosphere in the room became calm and relaxed, and Mr. Carter was the one who ultimately broke the stillness. "You know, I never imagined that losing my wallet would lead to all of this," he replied in a voice that was filled with emotion. As she gestured around him, Mrs. Thompson nodded and reached out to give her son a little squeeze on the hand. "Everything changed for us when Daniel made the decision to return your wallet. Daniel has always had a wonderful heart, but that day was the turning point. It was only that I was doing what I believed to be the proper thing, and Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat." Mr. Carter moved closer and looked directly into his eyes as he said, "I never expected it to lead to all of this. You didn't do it for me, Daniel, which is why it was so amazing. I mean, that's exactly what I meant." As they resumed their lunch, "You did it because it was the proper thing to do, and you may get praise or a reward for doing so." Reflected on the last 3 years, including the inauguration of the community center, Daniel's development as a student and as a community leader, and the expansion of the community. Daniel gazed around the table, his heart filled with appreciation, and in his eyes he saw the great changes that had taken place in their neighborhood. Because of the proud grin that his mother wore every time she looked at him, he was able to see the fatherly devotion that she had for him. Mr. Carter's eyes represent a connection that had become more profound with the passage of time, as Daniel pointed out in his voice. "I used to believe that returning the wallet was a little matter, but now I can really understand how it drew us closer together." I was flooded with emotion. Mrs. Thompson wiped a tear from her eye as she reflected on how the event fundamentally altered our lives. She spoke gently, and Mr. Carter nodded in agreement. "It's incredible how a single act of kindness can ripple out and touch so many lives," she remarked. "In accord, and Daniel, your trip has not yet come to an end. It is only getting started." He grinned as he felt a wave of warmth and purpose wash over him. He was aware that he had made a decision, regardless of what the future held for him. Distinction, and he was prepared for whatever was to come after that if you found the narrative of Daniel to be enjoyable. Also, Mr. Carter, please give this video a like and subscribe for more videos like this. I am grateful to you.